Night falls over Silesia, March 1944. A cold wind slides across the pine forests of Lower Silesia, whispering against barbed wire that glitters like frostbitten veins. The camp sleeps, or pretends to. Beneath its quiet skin, under the watchtowers and the dogs, the earth moves. Somewhere below the frozen dirt, a sound like the slow breathing of the dead. Scrape, pause, whisper, breathe. A man's hand, raw and trembling, pushes a tin can forward, scooping sand from a tunnel barely wider than his shoulders. The air tastes of rust and sweat. His name is Roger Bushell, Big X to the others, and tonight his heart pounds with the impossible rhythm of freedom. Above him, a German sentry drags on a cigarette, its ember flickering against the darkness like a dying star. He hears nothing. He suspects nothing. In the tunnels, 30 feet down, men crawl like shadows in the underworld. British, Canadian, Polish, Norwegian, South African, each heartbeat a drumbeat of defiance. They have spent more than a year carving their way out of hell with table knives, stolen wood, and sheer stubborn will. 600 feet of tunnel, timbered with stolen bedboards lit by homemade lamps burning margarine, air pumped by hand-built bellows, sand smuggled in trouser legs. Everything calculated, everything perilous. At the end of Harry, the longest of the 3 tunnels, the wooden trapdoor opens into a night so black it feels bottomless. One man emerges, then another. Breath clouds vanish into the air like ghosts set free. For a moment, the war above, the bombs, the front lines, the fire, disappears. There is only the sound of boots on snow, the hum of wind through pines, and the faint pulse of hope in men who have forgotten how it feels. Within hours, the camp will erupt in panic. The Luftwaffe will be humiliated. Hitler will rage. 76 airmen will vanish into the Polish night. What follows will become one of the most audacious, tragic, and unforgettable escapes in the history of war. A story of courage, obsession, and sacrifice buried under the cold earth of Stalag Luft III. The winter sky over Europe was a terrible place to die. The air burned thin and blue at 20,000 feet, and every explosion left a wound in the clouds. For the young men of Bomber Command, it was a daily wager with the devil. Engines roaring through flak storms, tracer fire carving red lines through the dark. Some prayed, others sang. Most just clenched their teeth and flew on. By 1942, the Royal Air Force had become both weapon and graveyard. Nearly half of its airmen would not return. The ones who did not die in flame often descended into another kind of purgatory, capture. The Germans called them Kriegsgefangene, prisoners of war. The Allies called them the boys who fell. And across the fields of occupied Europe, white parachutes bloomed like sudden tragic flowers. The first time Roger Bushell fell from the sky, he felt strangely calm. His Spitfire had been hit over the channel, flak through the engine, oil spraying across the windshield, the machine screaming itself apart. He bailed out at 12,000 feet, the air hammering against his body, the sea spinning below like liquid metal. The parachute cracked open with a slap that tore his shoulders, and the silence that followed was so complete it felt holy. When he hit the water, cold stabbed him to the bone. He drifted half-conscious until a German fishing boat hauled him aboard. A young sailor offered him a cigarette. "Für Sie, Engländer," the man said. Bushell took it, lit it, and stared at the horizon. His war had changed shape. The trains that carried captured airmen east were long, rattling skeletons of iron. Wooden boxcars, straw on the floor, frost on the windows. They stopped only for guards to shout or for prisoners to empty their buckets. Through the cracks, the men watched Europe slide by. The wreckage of cities, the slow march of soldiers, the endless gray of winter fields. For most, it was the last time they would see freedom. When the doors finally opened at Sagan, they were met by a silence so deep it seemed unnatural. The forest swallowed sound. The camp lay ahead, neat and geometric, fences within fences, towers at every corner, floodlights that swept across the snow like searching eyes. A sign read, Stalag Luft III. They had arrived at what the Germans proudly called their escape-proof camp. The Luftwaffe commandant, Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindiner, met the new arrivals with cold courtesy. A veteran of the First World War, he still believed in a soldier's honor. "You are airmen," he said in accented English. "You will be treated as such. You have no reason to fear unless you give us reason." His officers took notes, issued blankets, and assigned huts. The guards called them Englander with a hint of amusement. For the prisoners, the place felt almost civilized at first. The huts were wooden and drafty, but they stood on concrete foundations with stoves, bunks, and narrow windows. There was a library, a small theater, even a sports field. But beyond every small comfort was the fence. Always the fence. 2 layers of wire, a death strip between them, and towers armed with machine guns. Even the soil was chosen for its treachery. Pale sand that betrayed every tunnel. The message was clear: you will not leave. But soldiers who had lived in the sky were not built for cages. Within weeks, they began to test the limits. They measured distances, timed guard patrols, counted steps between huts. Every night, someone tried a new trick, hiding under laundry carts, sawing through fence posts, testing locks with spoons. Every morning, the guards found them and dragged them back, laughing, and yet the laughter never stopped the next man from trying. Bushell arrived at Stalag Luft III in 1943, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding even in rags. The veterans recognized him instantly. He had been captured once before, escaped twice, and recaptured both times. He'd seen the inside of Gestapo prisons and survived. Rumor said he'd stared down an SS officer who threatened him with a gun and replied, "You'll have to do better than that." When he walked into the hut, men stood without meaning to. Within days, he began reorganizing everything. They called it the Escape Committee, but under Bushell it became something closer to an underground government. He insisted on structure, secrecy, and purpose. Every plan had to be approved, every risk calculated. There would be no more careless escapes for glory. Their new mission was strategic: to humiliate the Reich, to force the Germans to waste their soldiers chasing ghosts across Europe. "If we can get 200 men out," Bushell told them, "we'll throw their system into chaos." Trains stopped. Roads closed. Troops pulled from the front. "Every man here can fight the war again from behind their lines." The room fell silent. It was madness. It was genius. Work began with whispers. Beneath the barracks, under stoves and floorboards, the earth waited. The first tunnel was named Tom. The second, Dick. The third, Harry. 3 arteries of hope, dug at once so that if one died, the others could live. The Germans would never expect so many at once. They dug with whatever they had. Table knives, spoons, tin cans, even pieces of broken bed frames sharpened into makeshift shovels. The tunnels were barely 2 feet wide, timbered with stolen wood. Men worked on their stomachs, scraping forward inches at a time. They could hear their own heartbeats echo in the narrow dark. Ventilation was built from tin milk cans, linked together and pumped by bellows made of rubber, scavenged from a crashed aircraft. Lamps were made from margarine and wicks of string. The tunnels glowed like arteries of fire beneath the camp. Disposing of the sand became an art. The earth was yellow. The surface soil was gray. Dumping it was suicide. So they invented the penguin. Pouches sewn inside trouser legs filled with sand, released grain by grain as men strolled the compound, shaking their feet as if restless. From the towers it looked like boredom. In truth, it was sabotage. They built fake walls inside huts to hide supplies, false floors to conceal trapdoors. A carpenter forged keys to the camp gates made from lead stolen out of toothpaste tubes. The camp barbers carved hidden compartments into brushes and razors. Tailors turned blankets into civilian coats, forged German insignia from tin foil. Every man played his part. Pilots became miners. Navigators became engineers. Musicians became counterfeiters. What they lacked in tools, they made up for in imagination. In the evenings, when the guards patrolled outside, the prisoners staged plays and concerts in the theater hut. Shakespeare, Noel Coward, even comedies. The laughter was real, but it served another purpose. It masked the sound of digging. Beneath the stage, a trapdoor led to Dick. While the audience cheered, men disappeared into the earth, their shovels tapping in rhythm with the applause. Life divided itself between surface and shadow. On the surface, games, letters, laughter, snowball fights. Below, darkness, heat, and fear. The air in the tunnels grew foul, heavy with sweat and candle smoke. Men fainted and had to be dragged backward by their ankles. Once, a tunnel wall collapsed, burying a digger alive. They dug him out with bare hands, coughing, trembling. "Keep digging," he gasped. And they did. The Germans searched constantly. Every few weeks came the cry, "Appel, search!" And boots thundered through the huts. Guards overturned bunks, ripped floorboards, stabbed bayonets into the ground. The prisoners stood in rows outside, faces calm. hearts slamming in their chests. Once they came within a breath of disaster. A guard spotted fresh sand near the washroom and ordered an excavation. The tunnel tom was uncovered, 100 feet long, nearly finished. The guards roared with triumph, dragging up beams, lamps, and buckets. The commandant ordered all tunnels sealed, all stoves checked, all soil tested. The prisoners watched, silent. Months of labor vanished in a day, but when the Germans left, Bushel turned to his men and said only, "Then we dig faster." They shifted their efforts to Harry. It ran from Hut 104 toward the northern woods, deeper and longer than any before. The entrance was hidden beneath a stove, sealed with a slab that fit so perfectly it fooled even the guards who heated it daily. Timbering came from hundreds of stolen bedboards. Each night the men carefully replaced them, so the bunks would not collapse. By autumn, Harry had reached nearly 400 feet. Electric lights ran through its length, wired to the camp grid with stolen cable. The lamps glowed dimly, their bulbs blackened with soot to hide from the guards. It was no longer a tunnel. It was a monument to patience, to madness, to hope. Outside, the war raged. The Allies were bombing Berlin. The Russians were pushing west. In the camp, news arrived in whispers. Hidden radios tuned to the BBC. Each victory lifted spirits. Each defeat steeled their resolve. "If we can get out," one man said, "we'll find our way home before it's over." But the winter of 1943 to 44 was cruel. Snow buried the camp. Frost cracked the ground. The tunnels froze solid. Men's hands bled from cold. Food rations shrank. The guards grew meaner. Yet every night the digging continued. They measured progress in inches. Bushel rarely slept. He walked the compound at dawn, memorizing guard rotations, studying lights and shadows. He spoke softly but carried an authority that no one questioned. To the men, he was not just their leader. He was the embodiment of their refusal to surrender. In January, tragedy struck again. During a transfer, the Germans discovered Dick. The tunnel was sealed and all work forbidden. The guards doubled patrols. Searchlights swept the camp all night. For weeks the men could not move without fear. But Bushel refused to stop. "We have one tunnel left," he said. "We finish it or we die trying." They returned to Harry with renewed fury. They worked in teams, breathing through tin masks, scraping at the frozen sand. The air grew so foul they could hardly stand. Still they dug. Still they believed. By March 1944, Harry was complete, 600 feet long, 30 feet deep. The exit lay beneath a small patch of snow just inside the tree line beyond the fence. The final weeks were chaos disguised as calm. Forgers worked day and night, stamping travel passes, ration cards, fake work permits. Artists painted maps on silk so they could be folded without tearing. Tailors finished civilian coats. The storehouse filled with food, compasses, matches, and stolen currency. 200 men were chosen to go. The rest would stay behind, waiting for news. Bushel walked through the barracks on the eve of the escape, stopping at each bunk, shaking hands. "If we fail," he said, "we fail together. If we succeed, we make history." That night, the lamps burned low and the men lay awake listening to the distant hum of the generators, the whisper of wind through pine trees, the heartbeat of freedom pulsing beneath their feet. Morning came slowly to Stalag Luft III. The forest mist drifted low, wrapping the fences in ghostly silence. Frost glittered on the barbed wire, and somewhere beyond the watchtowers, a train whistle moaned through the pine trees, a reminder that the world beyond still moved. While here, time itself seemed trapped. Inside the camp, the airmen stirred to the sound of the wooden clapper that signaled roll call. Boots scraped against frozen dirt as men stumbled from their huts, faces hollow from hunger, eyes squinting against the pale sun. The guards counted and clipped German, their breath forming small clouds in the cold. It was another morning in captivity, and the same routine, the same hopeless sky, and yet beneath that stillness, something was changing. The camp was alive with secrets. Each man had learned to wear two faces. To the guards they were weary, harmless, obedient, soldiers broken by defeat. But behind the fences they were builders, forgers, and conspirators in a war of silence. Beneath every polite smile lay a plan. Beneath every laugh, a lie. In Hut 104, the heart of the escape operation, the floorboards hid more than dust. Under the iron stove, a perfectly cut trapdoor led to a wooden shaft, narrow as a coffin. The men called it Harry. the last and most ambitious of the 3 tunnels. When the guard towers went dark, they worked in shifts of 3, one digging, one bagging sand, one hauling. The air down there was like breathing through cloth. Corporal Johnny Bull, a wiry Canadian with a dry grin, often joked, "You can tell who's been down there by the color of his skin. The tunnel makes ghosts of us." Bushell would nod, his face drawn but steady. "Then ghosts will be, until we walk out into the night." By early February, Harry had become a masterpiece of underground engineering. 600 feet long, with shored walls and a crude electric system that flickered from stolen wire. The lamps burned weakly, fed by voltage siphoned from the camp grid, but it was enough. At the tunnel's far end, the exit shaft stopped just short of the tree line, waiting for the final push. The risk was beyond reason. A single mistake and a guard's suspicion, a misplaced tool, a muffled cough, could bring ruin. Yet the men pressed on with an almost religious fervor. Every inch they dug was a prayer. Every plank nailed in place was an act of defiance against the Reich itself. Above ground, they carried on as if nothing existed beneath their feet. The forgers in Hut 123 labored day and night, their tables cluttered with ration cards, work permits, and travel passes. They used boot polish to mimic German ink, melted margarine to seal stamps, and pressed tin lids to emboss official crests. Under the dim light of a smuggled bulb, one could almost believe the war had turned into art. The mapmakers were worse, mad geniuses with trembling hands. They traced rivers and roads from memory, from glimpsed railway signs, from the faint outlines on Red Cross wrappings. Each line drawn was a lifeline, each mistake a death sentence. There was no currency in the camp except cigarettes and trust. Both were fragile. Cigarettes bought favors. An extra blanket, a spoon, a slice of bread saved from a parcel. Trust bought survival. One careless whisper could bring the Gestapo. The Germans were not blind. They knew the prisoners were plotting something. The Commandant, von Lindiner, had ordered increased inspections after the discovery of Tom. His officers grew harsher, the guards more suspicious. The Gestapo visited weekly now, men in long coats with dead eyes searching for hints of rebellion. But even they underestimated the audacity of what was unfolding below. At night, the camp changed shape. After curfew, when the last floodlights swept across the snow and the guards retreated to their towers, the underworld came alive. Beneath the barracks, candles flickered. Whispers echoed through the narrow shafts. It was the sound of men refusing to die quietly. In the tunnels, airmen dug by rhythm, scrape, haul, dump, breathe. The air grew hot and stale, and the tunnel walls creaked like the ribs of a dying beast. Sweat mixed with sand until faces became masks of earth. Sometimes the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into pure darkness. The silence then was unbearable, broken only by the sound of breathing and the slow, steady beat of courage. One night, the tunnel collapsed behind Flight Lieutenant John Williams, trapping him under the sand. The others dug with bare hands until their fingers bled. When they finally pulled him free, coughing and dazed, Bushell simply said, "You're still on duty tomorrow." Williams grinned through the dirt. "Wouldn't miss it, sir." The forger's hut was another world entirely. The smell of ink and sweat, the scratch of pen nibs over paper. They worked under blackout curtains. One man on watch, another grinding pencils into powder for shading. Fake German seals were pressed into soap molds, then cast in wax. Civilian clothes were cut from old uniforms, dyed with tea and ironed with makeshift presses. Each escapee would carry an identity, a destination, and a story rehearsed to perfection. Some would pose as foreign laborers bound for factories in the Ruhr, others as soldiers on leave, railway clerks, or farmhands. They learned German phrases by heart, practiced accents by whispering to each other through the night. One Polish pilot named Kazimierz Kaz Pawluk had once been an artist before the war. Now his hands stained with ink, he forged signatures with a precision that could have fooled the Führer himself. "You see," he said softly one night, "for every lie they told us, we make one of our own." Bushell watched it all with the calm of a man who understood the cost. He knew not all would survive. The risk of discovery was enormous. If caught, the Gestapo would make examples of them. But he never allowed fear to show. He moved through the camp like a shadow, encouraging, organizing, commanding. His code was simple: no man left behind and no man breaks. To the Germans, he was the embodiment of the incorrigible escape officer. To his men, he was Big X, the heartbeat of the impossible. When the snow began to thaw in early March, the air grew heavy with anticipation. The escape was close now. Each day brought new rehearsals. How to crawl silently, how to pass through the exit, how to blend into the dark. The men memorized train schedules, studied maps, and burned anything that might betray them. Still, fate had its own plans. One morning, a German sentry named Emil Schulze noticed something strange. Frost melting faster over one section of ground behind Hut 104. He mentioned it to his superior, who shrugged. "Perhaps the stove beneath," he said. "Do not waste time." The prisoners heard about it that evening. A wave of cold dread swept through the hut. If the guards decided to investigate, Harry would be lost, and with it the work of hundreds. For 2 days they waited in silent panic, but the Germans never dug. Whether by luck or fate, the tunnel survived. Bushel took it as a sign. "We go soon," he said. The date was set. March 24th, 1944, the night of the new moon. Darkness would be their ally. 200 men were selected. 76 would go first, the rest in waves as time allowed. Each man was issued forged papers, rations, and a plan. The tension in the camp was electric. Even those not chosen felt the pulse of it, the shared heartbeat of defiance. They rehearsed every motion. How to climb into the shaft, how to close the hatch behind them, how to signal the next man. Timing was everything. The last days before the escape passed in eerie calm. The guards joked, the dogs barked, and snow began to fall again, muffling the world in silence. The men waited, each carrying the weight of history on his back. That final night, as dusk fell over Sagan, the camp lights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. In Hut 104, the stove was moved for the last time. Beneath it, the wooden hatch creaked open, revealing the mouth of Harry. The first man climbed down into the darkness. The tunnel was colder than ever, the air thick with damp. Men crouched shoulder to shoulder, their breath fogging the air. Candles flickered. Each knew that once they reached the exit, there was no turning back. But as the first man pushed through the final section, a terrible realization dawned. The exit was short. The tunnel ended 20 feet before the tree line. They would emerge in open ground, visible to the towers if the light swept near. For a moment, panic rippled through the men. But then Bushel's voice came through the line, calm and resolute. "We go anyway. We've come too far to stop." One by one, they crawled forward. Each man carried a small bundle. Forged papers, food, a compass, hope. The first emerged, froze against the snow, then darted for the trees. Another followed. And another. Above, the guards smoked and laughed, oblivious. The camp slept, unaware that history was unfolding beneath its foundations. By dawn, 76 men had vanished into the Silesian forest. When the Germans discovered the open hole, chaos erupted. Sirens wailed, dogs barked, soldiers poured into the woods. The hunt had begun. For now, the camp was silent. Bushel, exhausted but unbroken, stood at the tunnel mouth before sealing it behind him. "That's all we can do," he said softly. "God help them now." In the distance, the forest waited, dark and infinite. Somewhere out there, his men were running. Through snow, through fear, through the breath of freedom. The great escape had begun. In the darkness beneath Stalag Luft III, men became moles. The air was thick, metallic, and close enough to taste. Every breath carried the smell of sand, sweat, and iron. Above them, the world of fences and guards went on as usual. Roll calls, searches, barking dogs. But below, the underworld of Harry came alive. When the lamps flickered to life, their faint glow revealed a world built by hands, not machines. Wooden beams lined the walls like ribs. Sandbags stacked like lungs around the fragile structure. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a man to crawl, his shoulders scraping both sides. The only sounds were the scraping of tin cans, the whisper of shovels, and the distant rhythm of air being pumped through the narrow hoses that kept them alive. It was not work. It was devotion. Each digger had a routine. 15 minutes forward, 15 minutes hauling, 15 minutes hauling back. The heat was unbearable, the air thin. Many stripped to their waists, sweat pouring down their backs as they shoveled sand into small sacks. They spoke little. Voices wasted oxygen. Instead, they worked by instinct, by touch, by faith that the tunnel would hold. The bellows, handmade from old leather kit bags and bits of rubber, wheezed rhythmically. pushing air through tin pipes made from powdered milk cans. It sounded like a living thing, gasping for breath with every stroke. When it stopped, everything stopped. Panic rose fast in that blackness. Lungs burned. But they always fixed it. They always carried on. Somewhere near the middle of the line, Warrant Officer Johnny Bull hummed under his breath, old songs from back home, a thread of sanity in the dark. Behind him, Wally Floody, the Canadian engineer, kept the structure stable, his mind working like a metronome. 3 boards per foot, nails evenly spaced, supports placed every 12 inches. If one goes, he'd mutter, we all go. Floody had once worked in mines before the war. Now he worked in a grave of his own making. The soil here was treacherous, loose, sandy, and pale yellow. It wanted to collapse. Every inch of progress meant risk. Still, he found beauty in the work. The precision, the control, the sense that he was building more than a tunnel. He was building a legend. Above ground, the routine continued. Guards barked orders. Men walked circles around the compound, releasing sand through their penguin pouches. The trick was in the shuffle, subtle, rhythmic steps that scattered the grains without detection. When a guard's gaze lingered too long, the man would stop to tie his boot or cough. Then he'd move on. The sand changed color near the edges of the camp, blending with the natural soil. The forest winds carried it away. 100 small acts of rebellion, invisible, unstoppable. At night, when the lamps went out in the barracks, whispers took their place. Men told stories of home, of wives and children, of skies they'd once flown. For some, the tunnel had become more than an escape. It was purpose, a reason to wake each morning in a world designed to break them. Do you ever think about what comes after? Asked Flight Lieutenant Tim Whalen one evening, his fingers stained with ink from forgery work. Bushell leaned back on his bunk, the faint glow of a cigarette tracing his profile. After, he said quietly, after is freedom. And freedom is whatever we build next. No one spoke for a while. The snow fell outside, soft and steady. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The Germans prided themselves on control. They had built Stalag Luft III as a fortress. Fences, watchtowers, seismographs buried in the ground. They believed science would prevent chaos. But science couldn't see the human will. Each day the prisoners found new ways to deceive. They used mirrors to signal across compounds, coded messages in letters home. Even small diversions like fake fights to draw guards away from sensitive areas. One prisoner, Flight Officer Gordon King, staged an entire medical emergency to distract a patrol while diggers surfaced briefly to remove debris. Another forged passes for imaginary construction crews, allowing men to move between compounds without suspicion. The guards, to their credit, were not fools. They searched often. Every appel, roll call, was a test. The prisoners lined up in the cold counted, recounted. The Germans prowled the huts, stabbing bayonets through floors, tapping for hollows. Once they found a tunnel decoy, a fake shaft filled with nothing but sand. They congratulated themselves on stopping another escape, never realizing the real one was only 20 feet away. In the tunnels, time lost meaning. Hours bled into days, days into months. The lamps burned low, the air thickened. Claustrophobia was constant. Men hallucinated, walls breathing, sand whispering their names. Some refused to go down again after panic attacks. No one judged them. The fear was too human. Still, others became addicted to the dark. It gave them something no guard could take, control. In the narrow space, they were masters of their fate. They carved each foot of freedom with their own hands. Floody often said, "You can't imagine how alive you feel when death is one mistake away." As Harry grew longer, the logistics became a nightmare. The sand had to go somewhere. The wood had to come from somewhere. Even candles and air pipes became treasures. They scavenged relentlessly. Bed slats, book covers, tin trays, all vanished into the underworld, the Germans noticed. One morning a guard complained, "These English sleep on air now, always missing boards." The prisoners laughed. "Perhaps, Herr Feldwebel, it's the climate. Wood shrinks in the cold." The guard grunted and moved on. Even the Commandant von Lindiner felt a grudging admiration for their ingenuity. "These men," he confided to an aide, "would build a cathedral if we locked them in a barn." He was right. By January 1944, Harry was almost complete. The diggers estimated 600 feet, far beyond the fence, deep beneath the forest. The final task was to breach the surface without alerting the guards. They built a vertical shaft at the tunnel's end, 30 feet up through frozen soil. It was brutal work. The sand above was unstable. Collapse meant instant death, so they reinforced it with everything they had. Timbers, blankets, even tin plates hammered flat. When at last a faint draft of cold air kissed their faces, the men froze in awe. The tunnel had reached the world again. They closed it quickly, sealing it beneath a false trapdoor of dirt and pine needles. From above, it looked like untouched forest floor. Only those who dug it knew what lay beneath, the artery that would soon carry 76 men into the unknown. The final phase began. Forgery intensified. The mapmakers traced Europe with trembling fingers. The tailors stitched until their needles bent. Food was rationed. Every crumb mattered. They made chocolate bars from powdered milk and margarine, meat from tinned stew and dried peas. The escape kits grew. Compasses, matches, buttons, coins, documents. Each was small enough to fit in a pocket, each a lifeline in enemy territory. Bushel oversaw it all with surgical precision. He assigned men to destinations, some toward Poland and the Baltic, others south toward Czechoslovakia, others west toward France. He studied German train timetables, memorized routes, even calculated how far a man could walk in a night without rest. He had no illusions. Many would die, but as he told his men, if even one makes it home, it will have been worth it. Above them, the world was collapsing. The Allies had invaded Italy. The Eastern Front was bleeding. German morale faltered. Even the guards grew weary. One confided to a prisoner, "This war will bury us all." But in Stalag Luft III, hope burned hotter than ever. The camp was alive with hidden purpose. Every man, even those not escaping, contributed. Some served as decoys, others as lookouts. The orchestra practiced louder to mask the hammering from below. Plays ran nightly in the theater hut, comedy, farce, satire, all to distract the guards. Laughter became camouflage. They built a periscope from mirror shards and tin, allowing the diggers to see daylight without emerging. Through it, they watched the forest sway in the wind, the same wind that would soon touch their faces again. But the deeper the dream grew, the more fragile it became. The men began to feel the weight of what they were risking. For every laugh, there was a moment of silence afterward, a shared understanding that some of them would not return. One night, as they sat around a smuggled radio, listening to the BBC's muffled signal, they heard the news of an Allied bombing raid gone wrong. Hundreds dead. The men said nothing. Finally, Bushel whispered, "Then we'll make it count. For everyone lost up there, we'll strike back down here." That was his gift, turning sorrow into purpose. In the final week before the escape, tension reached breaking point. The Germans sensed something. Patrols doubled. Searchlights swept wider. Dogs barked endlessly at night. Yet nothing was found. The prisoners grew quiet. Every glance felt heavier, every sound sharper. The camp had become a loaded gun, and everyone knew it would soon fire. The night before the escape, Bushel stood outside his hut staring at the sky. Snow drifted down in silence. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we go home." March 24th, 1944. A moonless sky. The cold cut like a blade. By dusk, the camp lay cloaked in silence. The pines stood motionless, their black spires piercing the clouds. In the distance, the faint hum of a German generator filled the night air. Inside Hut 104, the men moved like ghosts, every motion rehearsed, every whisper deliberate. They had waited for this night for over a year. Now it had come. The stove in the corner glowed faintly, its iron belly warm against the frozen air. Beneath it lay the mouth of Harry, 600 feet of tunnel carved from faith and desperation. The trapdoor lifted with a quiet sigh, and a gust of cold air rolled in. One by one, the men crouched at the edge, their breath hanging like smoke. "Go with God," murmured Bushel, his voice barely audible. The first man, Canadian pilot Johnny Bull, dropped into the hole. The wood creaked under his boots. He glanced up once, nodded, and vanished into the dark. The next followed, then another. Above, the rest waited, listening to the soft rhythm of the rope ladder, the faint thud of boots on sand. Every sound mattered now. Every heartbeat felt like thunder. Below, the tunnel breathed. The air was damp and thick, the walls trembling with the movement of men. Candles flickered in tin holders, throwing long shadows across the timbered walls. The line of escapees stretched back through the darkness, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath a slow, synchronized rhythm. The diggers at the far end worked by instinct. The final shaft had been sealed with a plug of frozen soil, and they scraped at it with knives and bare hands. Above them, the surface was snow. The first to emerge would have to break through quietly, then crawl through open ground to the tree line, 20 feet of death between freedom and discovery. The air in the tunnel thickened. Men coughed softly, eyes watering from candle smoke. The rope pulley creaked as sandbags were hauled backward. Every motion was mechanical, disciplined. It was the culmination of months of practice, a ballet in the dark. Finally, a breath of cold air seeped in through the cracks. The plug gave way. The night entered the tunnel, icy and alive. Above ground, the forest waited, silent, infinite. The snow muffled every sound, but it also betrayed every step. In the distance, the faint yellow lights of the guard towers blinked through the trees. The first man, Bull, pushed upward. Snow spilled down onto his face. He froze, listening, nothing. Slowly he crawled out, his body half buried in frost. The air smelled of pine and freedom. He turned, signaled the next man. In the tunnel below, the signal passed like an electric current. 2 tugs on the rope. Safe. The next man climbed. Then another. For the first time in years, men of the Royal Air Force walked free under a German sky. Back in the hut, Bushell stood near the stove, checking his watch. Midnight. The line moved slowly. At this pace, only a fraction of the men would make it out before dawn. But to rush was to die. He knelt by the hatch, whispered, "Steady. Keep the pace." The men waited in tense silence, listening to the sounds below, the creak of timber, the shuffle of movement, the quiet murmur of voices. Every few minutes, the hatch lifted and another man slipped down. The air grew colder, the fear thicker. Suddenly, a flicker of light swept across the hut window, a guard's flashlight. The men froze. The beam lingered, then moved on. Someone exhaled shakily. "Too close," muttered one. Bushell didn't answer. Outside, snow continued to fall. In the tunnel, progress slowed. A trolley jammed halfway down the line. The men pushed, grunting softly, their hands bleeding. The air pump wheezed. The candles dimmed. Panic rippled briefly through the darkness. Then a voice, calm, firm. "Keep it moving." It was Roger Bushell, now deep in the line himself. His presence steadied them. The trolley moved again, the rhythm resumed. At the exit, the snowdrift had grown thicker. The men had to clear it silently, one handful at a time, their breath fogged in the cold. They moved with the patience of saints. Every few minutes they froze as the hum of boots passed above. German patrols walking the perimeter. One wrong move, one sound, and 600 men's labor would end in blood. By 2 a.m., 20 men were out. They vanished into the trees, splitting into small groups, each with a destination burned into their minds. Breslau, Prague, the Baltic coast. They would steal trains, hide in barns, cross mountains. The odds were impossible, but odds meant nothing now. At 3 a.m., disaster. A guard in the North Tower lit a cigarette, his lighter flaring in the darkness. He looked out across the snow and frowned. A faint line marred the untouched whiteness leading toward the woods. He leaned forward. Down below, the next man was halfway out when a gust of wind blew his breath into the open air. The vapor shimmered faintly in the guard's torchlight. The guard straightened. "Was ist das?" he shouted. The alarm bell began to ring. Chaos erupted. In the tunnel, men froze. Above, the camp exploded with movement. Floodlights blazed to life, dogs barked, boots thundered across the snow. Someone screamed, "Close the hatch!" But it was too late. The line had broken. The last man in the tunnel turned, shouting down the shaft. "They've seen us! They've seen us!" Panic surged. Some tried to climb back. Others pressed forward, desperate to reach the surface. The tunnel groaned under the weight. Candles went out. The air turned black and suffocating. Bushell, still near the middle of the line, shouted for calm. "Stay down! Stay down!" His voice carried through the dark, strong and steady. Gradually, the chaos slowed. Those already in the forest ran harder. Those still below waited, listening to the madness above. In the distance, machine guns rattled into the night, not at the tunnel, but at shadows moving through the trees. By dawn, 76 men had escaped. The rest remained in the tunnel, sealed behind the hatch, their dreams buried with them. When the Germans finally found the exit, they stared in disbelief. 600 feet of engineering, right beneath their feet. The commandant's face turned white. Mein Gott, he whispered. Sie haben es wirklich getan. They actually did it. He ordered the camp on lockdown. Every hut searched, every man interrogated. But by then the forest was empty. The fugitives were already miles away. The escape had begun like a whisper and ended like an explosion. Across the snowbound countryside, 76 men scattered like seeds in the wind. Some found help, a farmer, a train conductor, a priest willing to risk everything. Others found only the cold. That morning, Bushel and two companions, Flight Lieutenant Bernard Scheidhauer and Lieutenant Bram van der Stock, boarded a train bound for Breslau. Their forged papers passed inspection. The German conductor nodded them through. For the first time, Bushel saw daylight without a fence between him and the horizon. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered, "We did it." He had no way of knowing that the Reich itself would soon descend upon them. At Stalag Luft III, silence replaced chaos. The Germans walked through the compound in disbelief. The tunnel was a monument to humiliation. For hours, guards and officers stood staring down into the hole, unable to speak. Commandant von Lindeiner reported to Berlin. The response came quickly, too quickly. Hitler himself had been informed. Furious, he ordered 50 of the escapees shot as a lesson. The order spread through the Gestapo like wildfire. The men who had defied the Reich would pay for it with their lives. But for now, in the stillness before the storm, the prisoners who remained looked out through the wire at the forest and smiled. For one night, they had beaten the system. For one night, they had been free. In the following days, the Germans launched the largest manhunt in Europe. Tens of thousands of soldiers, police, and civilians joined the search. Dogs tracked footprints. Posters went up in towns and villages. Trains were stopped and searched. Slowly, the fugitives were caught. In barns, in stations, at borders. Some resisted, some surrendered. Each capture tightened the noose. But a few, only a few, made it through. In the forest, snow still covered the footprints of the men who had vanished into legend. Stalag Luft III returned to its grim rhythm. Roll calls, fences, silence. Yet the air was different now. The camp had changed forever. Because even as the guards patrolled, they knew the prisoners had done the impossible. They had escaped not just the wire, but the very idea of captivity, and that could never be undone. The forest swallowed them whole. By dawn, 76 men moved across occupied Europe, scattered silhouettes in the snow, each one carrying forged papers, stolen bread, and a heartbeat loud enough to betray them. Behind them, Stalag Luft III burned with the noise of searchlights and fury. The guards tore through huts, shouting names, firing into the air, dogs howling in the distance. The tunnel lay open to the sky like a wound. But the men were gone. Roger Bushel's group headed south toward the railway. Others struck east toward Poland or west toward the Reich's shattered cities. Some aimed for the Baltic, hoping to find ships. Others planned to reach Switzerland, hundreds of miles away. They had no radios, no compasses except what they could hide in their boots, no maps beyond the ones folded in their memories. Yet they walked with the calm of men who had already defeated their captors. Freedom, for the first time in years, was real enough to taste. Cold, sharp, terrifying. The first days were chaos and wonder. Flight Lieutenant Bram van der Stock, a Dutch pilot, trekked alone through the Silesian woods. The snow was deep, the nights endless, but he pressed on, sleeping in barns, stealing food, trading words of German he barely knew. Once, a farmer's wife gave him bread and a candle. "Gott segne dich," she whispered. "God bless you." He nodded, unable to speak. Elsewhere, Canadian officers Gordon King and Wally Floody were less lucky. A patrol stopped them outside a small town. Their forged papers, perfect in the dim light of a camp, failed under scrutiny. The soldiers drew pistols. "Papiere sind falsch," one said. The dream ended there. They were dragged away in silence. By the third day, 20 men had been caught. By the fifth, 30. The manhunt had become the largest in German history. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring was humiliated. The Luftwaffe's escape-proof camp had become a global embarrassment. Hitler's rage was volcanic. He demanded every recaptured prisoner be shot. executed while attempting to escape. His generals hesitated. Even Himmler, cold and calculating, urged restraint. But the order was clear. The Führer wanted blood. The Gestapo took over. Across Europe, black cars rolled through the snow, men in leather coats, pistols heavy in their pockets. The prisoners were moved from station to station, questioned briefly, then driven to remote fields or woods. There they were told to stretch their legs, to relieve themselves, to enjoy a cigarette. Then they were shot in the back of the head. 50 men in total. 50 men murdered in cold blood under the false pretense of escape. News of the killings spread slowly through the camps. At Stalag Luft III, the prisoners gathered in silence as the names were read aloud. Roger Bushell, gone. Wally Floody, gone. Tim Whalen, Bob Stewart, Johnny Bull, gone. Some men wept. Others stared into space, unable to comprehend that their brothers, men who had risked everything for freedom, were now dead, not on the battlefield, but as targets of revenge. The Commandant von Lindiner was broken by it. He had warned Berlin that such actions would violate every code of war, every principle of honor. But his protests meant nothing. When he walked through the compound that evening, his face was gray. "I am sorry," he said simply. "This is not war. This is murder." Even the guards stood differently after that. They no longer laughed. They no longer taunted. Something sacred had been broken, and everyone knew it. Of the 76 who escaped, only 3 made it home. Bram van der Stock reached the Netherlands, then France, where the resistance smuggled him across Spain to Gibraltar. From there, he was flown back to England, the only man to return to the skies. Later, he would fly again for the RAF, and when the war ended, he would live quietly, carrying the ghosts of 73 men in his heart. Norwegian pilots Per Bergsland and Jens Müller reached Sweden by train and fishing boat, crossing the freezing Baltic under cover of fog. They were welcomed as heroes, though they never called themselves that. The rest, 73, were recaptured. 50 were murdered. The remaining 23 were returned to captivity, some never speaking of it again. When the war ended, the world learned the truth. British investigators of the Royal Air Force's Special Investigation Branch hunted down the killers. It was one of the largest manhunts of the post-war years. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the chain of command. The Gestapo officers who carried out the shootings, the bureaucrats who signed the orders, the drivers who looked away. By 1947, many of them stood trial. Some were hanged, others imprisoned. Justice, incomplete but real, was finally done. At Nuremberg, the murders of the great escape prisoners were used as evidence of war crimes. The world was reminded that even in captivity, courage could shame cruelty. For those who survived the camps, memory became both wound and weapon. They spoke of Bushell not as a martyr, but as a leader who had given them purpose. "He taught us that captivity was only a condition," one airman said later. Defeat was a choice. The tunnel itself, Harry, was filled in by the Germans after the discovery. After the war, it was uncovered again by Allied engineers. Inside, they found the remnants of tin lamps, wooden supports, and a small piece of paper with a single word written in pencil: freedom. No one knew who had written it. No one needed to. Years later, long after the guns fell silent and the world rebuilt itself, men returned to Sagan, now Sagan, Poland. The forest had grown thicker, the air quieter. Where once stood the wire and towers, only outlines remained. But the earth still carried the memory. Visitors said they could feel it, the pulse of something defiant beneath their feet. At the site of the tunnel, they erected a stone memorial. On it were carved the names of the 50 men who had died for the right to be free: British, Canadian, Polish, South African, Australian. Each name etched into the rock like a heartbeat frozen in time. At the top, simple words: they gave their lives for freedom. Time did not dull the story. It grew. Books were written. Films made. The world called it the Great Escape, but those who lived it never used that phrase. To them, it was simply the job, the continuation of duty by other means. In the 1960s, when Hollywood came calling, some of the survivors visited the set. They watched actors in crisp uniforms crawl through reconstructed tunnels under studio lights. One of them, now gray-haired, smiled and said quietly, "The real one didn't have a script, he was right. The real one was written in sweat, blood, and faith. Decades later, archaeologists uncovered fragments of the original tunnel: splintered wood, rusted tin lamps, broken rails from the miniature trolley system. When the light touched them again after 80 years, the metal still gleamed faintly, as if remembering the hands that once built them. To touch that wood was to touch defiance itself. The men of Stalag Luft III did not escape to save themselves. They escaped to remind the world that even when freedom is caged, the will to seek it cannot be. Every inch of Harry had been carved by that belief, that to resist tyranny, even with a spoon, was to remain human. In the end, the great escape was both triumph and tragedy, a victory of the spirit and a massacre of the body. 50 graves stood where hope had once run underground, but the dream those men carried did not die with them. It crossed borders, oceans, generations. Every time a man or woman refused to bow somewhere in that defiance, the echo of Stalag Luft III could be heard, the scrape of a tin can against sand, the whisper of a shovel in the dark. Freedom, after all, is not a gift. It is something dug for inch by those who refuse to stop. In the silence of the Sagan forest, if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear it. The faint hum of air through tin pipes, the soft creak of wood, the heartbeat of courage beneath the ground, and if you listen closer, a voice, Roger Bushell's perhaps, carried on the wind, for freedom.